they can sip their coffee from cups like this, like we do down here on Earth.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Coffee Literature Review. Today I'm joined by Doran Pennington, as always, and we have a very special guest joining us from Costa Mesa, California, David Yardley. Now, this is a little bit unusual because today we're talking about 3 papers concerning whether coffee mold produces Ochratoxin A. It's also unusual because this is the first time we've had someone who sent me papers to read and said we need to have a discussion about mold in coffee. So first of all, I'm grateful for David's contribution there to get us thinking about a topic that's ever so slightly off of our standard brewing of coffee and the chemistry of coffee angle of this podcast. And also because I think we're going to learn something here about fear-mongering in the coffee industry. David, you got a lot of experience because you've been a barista and then eventually started your own roasting and now 4 cafe locations with the company Moongoat Coffee, based out of California. We're really grateful to have you.
Good. How are you? I feel left out without a cool microphone, though.
Don't you worry about that. When we first started, I was like, number one thing we need to do is look good. Kind of like when I was learning coffee, I was like, I got to get that slurp right.
Yeah.
I want to say thanks for 2 things. The email that got us thinking that we should actually record the pod on mold. Second of all, for sending us 4 lovely coffees.
Awesome.
It's the first Wush Wush we've had in the lab.
Cool.
We were remarkably low on naturals.
Nice.
Nice to have a little funk in the lab as well.
Southern California is natural territory too.
Let's get to that. So you're in Costa Mesa, right? And
yes, sir.
But you haven't always been in Costa Mesa. I think I saw that you've been a barista at Starbucks, like a manager for like forever, for 10 years prior to branching out. Tell us how Costa Mesa was the choice for Moongoat, and tell us what Moongoat's up to.
I've always loved Costa Mesa, and even our etymology of the name has a little bit of Costa Mesa in it because it was called Goat Hill. For a long time, that was a snide remark of the beach city saying, you don't even have an oceanfront view, you're a goat hill. So we're reclaiming it. We do coffee in a simple way. Even though it is specialty coffee, we want it to be as approachable as possible. But I come into coffee by accident. I got a job at a local roaster, Diedrich Coffee, in 2000, early 2000s. I even forget the year that it was.
Yeah.
But and I just swept the floor and did dishes. And I didn't think I would end up in a career of coffee, but I remember buying my first bag of Stumptown coffee that was an Ethiopia natural, and I joked that was the most expensive bag of coffee I ever bought because it mired me into starting a roastery some 15 years later.
Well, it's nice to hear a story where you entered from the very bottom of the totem pole in coffee and grew it all the way to having, it's actually one of my dreams too, is to have a shop at some point, maybe a roastery. I don't know. I don't know. I hear it's not the most lucrative business, but it's a passion project that can bring you deep happiness.
Certainly. That's what you do it for. You do it for the fringe benefits, for sure, right? That because you're not gonna have a lucrative career. But one of the seminal moments for me too was when coffee really became a career. Truly, was I went to UC Davis in 2013 for a coffee science seminar, and that changed it from just a job to okay, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Who was speaking? Do you recall?
Oh man, there was so many. Dr. William Risenpart was an impactful chemistry professor at UC Davis that spoke. And that was probably the talk that did it for me at that seminar. And they didn't even, it was kind of batting around. I was listening to AM radio back in the day on my drive to work, and they announced that UC Davis was considering having a coffee science program, and I booked a flight that day. And had enough flexibility in my job that I didn't need to ask my boss for permission.
Yeah.
And it was funny because then when I told them I was working for Starbucks at the time, they actually sent me a Starbucks' note taker. So they ended up paying for the trip, and it was a great time. And then I quit like the next year. So they weren't so happy that they sent me.
Whatever. I mean, but it's nice to hear that you're also getting into that science ground level thing too, because when we talk to people about this scientific papers and just the scientific process, not only on the podcast, but also in the lab downstairs, it's pretty clear that it's a great platform to teach people fundamental science, but it's also like a weirdly dangerous one because people somehow know enough to think they're experts in the topic without truly knowing anything. Because they brew the coffee at home, so therefore they know coffee. Kind of like because I watch football at home, do I know football? It's like, no, I enjoy coffee. I enjoy football. I'm not an expert in neither of them. Right.
Certainly.
Well, so we started this pod for exactly that reason, was to take the most motivated people who I thought would enjoy reading papers with us, read them.
Yeah.
And then up to this point, it's been me finding people and telling them to read papers. But that's not how this podcast came about. It was you finding me and telling me to read papers, which is good.
But I started listening to the podcast and I really loved the premise.
Okay.
Because I think we do fall prey to that Dunning-Kruger effect of like, I brew coffee all the time. I know everything there is to know about it. Right. And the more that I know, the more that I realize this is a lifetime of being a student of coffee. Right.
Sure. Well, it's immensely complicated, and I think every year or so there's always a discussion like that, basically flip-flops between coffee's good for you because of the antioxidant effects, and coffee's bad for you because of the carcinogenic effects, and blah blah blah. And so I guess that's a nice platform, leads us right into this. So we're going to talk about 3 papers, but I think these 3 papers sort of canvas a broader spectrum of just an ongoing discussion, an ongoing scientific effort to understand the impact of mold and its production of Ochratoxin A specifically, but other compounds as well that are seemingly bad for you, carcinogenic, can cause all sorts of other issues as well. While the work on Ochratoxin A predates the 3 papers we're talking about, and some of them even do a nice job of citing articles in the lead up to this, going back to the early and mid 80s. These 3 papers sort of capture, I guess, different time points, different levels of knowledge, different types of coffee that they were looking at. The 3 papers are, the first one published in 1995 in the journal Food and Chemical Technology is titled The Occurrence of Ochratoxin A in Coffee. Then we're going to look at a paper in 1998 in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry titled The Behavior of Ochratoxin A During Green Coffee Roasting and Soluble Coffee Manufacture. In other words, making instant coffee from that extract. And then finally, the most recent paper we're going to discuss is a paper published in 2018 in the journal Food Science and Biotechnology titled The Determination of a Potentially Mycotoxigenic Fungi in Coffee from Nayarit. Is that how I pronounce the right? Nayarit is correct?
This is all I've ever heard it pronounced as.
All right. Very good. So the last paper that we talked about was actually the first paper that you came across in your Google searching, but I'm going to encourage us to actually start with the oldest one and work towards
chronologically.
Who asks you most frequently about mold and maybe even specifically Ochratoxin A in coffee?
And this is why I'm here, is that I get that question frequently. And it's primarily customers who come to me and say, I saw this on Instagram, influencer X saying, you should stop drinking coffee because of mold. You should drink this coffee because it's certified mold free, or something of that similar respect. And to be fair, I may have fallen prey. We do specialty coffee. Specialty coffee doesn't have mold. And that, as I've done a little bit more research, is certainly not the case.
Have you ever, in your green coffee acquisition time, have you ever come across a bag that is obviously molded?
I have not personally, but in just discussing this with other green importers, specifically decaffeinated coffee seems to also be susceptible to it. And I think that's largely because of the way that it's post-processed and stored.
Exactly.
Because you're rehydrating it again. So you're basically doing what some of these studies are doing in terms of creating a susceptible environment, right? To actually measure how much mold can be promulgated throughout the coffee.
We published early in 2024 this paper on adding water to coffee before you grind to make the static go away, right?
Yes.
And one of the experiments that we were trying to do was like, can you rehydrate coffee to push moisture back into the beans so that instead of having to squirt water on them, you can just store them in a way that osmotically pushes it in there. And I had this one undergrad who was, if you could make a mistake at any scientific moment, this guy was the guy who was going to make every single one. In fact, like he was in the hit TV show Squid Game, he would be the first guy to die. 100%.
Yeah.
Like he's gone. So he submerged coffee in water for some period. How long was it?
It was like 3 days, and it was sealed.
Yeah, and so then when he uncorked it and he like dried it out on the table, I walked in and I smelled the smell of like, oh, heinous mold. We're talking, and it was visible too. Like you don't, the level of molding we're talking about here is tremendous. And they were totally fine. The thing that bothered me the most was they were just like continuing to work with that coffee sat on the counter in the lab, and I'm sitting there dying. Like I'm like, what the hell is in the air? Anyway, so all that's just to say, when you smell a moldy when you see a molded roasted coffee, you know, like this is not a like a little thing. It's a big thing. And we're going to get into that.
And it happens rapidly, right?
Oh, super fast. I mean, like it's because if you look at the experimental setup in these papers, the one commonality to get mold to grow is you got to add water.
Yes.
It's absolutely crystal clear. It's like if the thing gets wet and stays wet and there's sugary stuff around, in other words, carbohydrates that these little mold can nibble on, then it's going to poop.
Coffee is full of polysaccharides, right? So
totally. So if you get coffee wet, then it's going to poop out some bad compounds. But the thing that I wanted to get at for paper one, and it's a question for you, right, is that if you look at who studied this, there a lot of two of these papers coming out of Switzerland, and in paper one, they're talking about the occurrence of this toxin in coffee broadly defined, and they go through and they one of their samples is like an obviously clearly detected molded sample.
Right.
So that means someone already noticed that it was molded. So so in figure 3, I mean, one of the things that you look at in figure 3 in this paper is it's basically just a bar chart of the micrograms of Ochratoxin A per kilogram of coffee beans. And I think the thing that jumps out at you is that for samples 6, 7, and 8, which were the obviously molded coffees, there's a lot of it.
I have never experienced that level. However, I should say that, of course, I've seen molded coffee, right? In a similar circumstance to that unfortunate undergrad who had a tremendous setup, right, to create a moldy product. But it's been forgotten about things. You know, it's been a bucket that you have forgotten about for many years and is in a humid environment or many weeks, let's say at least, right, behind something, and you discover it, and it is so toxic feeling and, experiencing that you want to just throw it away wearing an N95 mask and close out the bucket and be done with it, right? Exactly. That's the extent of my, anecdotal research on that.
No, you're an expert, because that's basically all you need to know. So let's talk about a couple of things that are really, really important as we move into this. First is, how dangerous is Ochratoxin A? And second of all, what is Ochratoxin A? So you've thought about this a lot. You've probably done some research. So tell us, do you know the sort of the risk factor, the amount that you can expose yourself to?
That's a great question. And I did not get a firm number, but I know that there is, toxicity is in the dose, right?
Yep.
So there is a dose where it is relatively, quote unquote, safe for human consumption, but also, the correlation is really still in animal species besides human animals, where we have observed the major thing, which is, that you could have renal failure with high enough doses of this mycotoxin. And specifically, in the Balkan region is where it's been observed as a loose correlation. There's not a direct cause and effect that has been proven, although, certainly there is, in animal studies, the direct cause and effect proven. And I don't think that we really fund studies where we dose people at the levels, that we would dose animals, right?
Well, yeah. So in paper one, actually, one of the critical things they try and do in the last paragraphs is make an estimate of how dangerous this stuff is for the Swiss population. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. But I just want to say that in 1990, which, by the way, is 5 years after this first paper was, 5 years before this first paper was published, The World Health Organization stated that the limit was 112 nanograms per kilogram per week of this material. And so I'll do the math for you. If the average person weighs 70 kilograms, that shakes out to be roughly 1 microgram per day. So, okay, so 1 microgram per day. So I want people to just internalize that magic number is that above that, and maybe you're going to start to have some issues associated with this molecule. Below that, and it seems like the human body can handle it, roughly. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Second thing is, where the heck does this come from? So they draw a chemical structure. Does that mean anything to you? You train in chemistry?
No, I mean, I am not trained in chemistry besides a couple chem classes, right? Which yeah. I have to admit, I studied to pass the tests.
Okay, good. Well, did you pass?
I did.
Ochratoxin A is the product of one of your amino acids in your body, phenylalanine. It's basically in every protein on Earth, interacting with what they call a metabolite, ochratoxin alpha. Ochratoxin alpha is the decomposition product of ochratoxin A, and it is what you deliberately try to make because it's not nearly as toxic as ochratoxin A. The reason that ochratoxin A is toxic is because anytime you have something in your body that has an amino acid in it, it starts to do amino acid-y type things. Like it tricks your body into it. So then that's where bad stuff happens, right? Because if you start getting into your proteins and starts messing with stuff. So the typical way that people try and target this is you just expose any of those amide or amide bonded, depending on which part of the world you're from, amide bonded molecules. You just wash them with base and they immediately come apart. So that's sodium hydroxide. So just for what it's worth, you could wash the outside of coffee that might have this mold growing on it, and you can wash it with base. And in principle, with who knows what that'll do to the coffee, but I definitely know it's not going. Ochratoxin A is not going to survive that. Who knows? Maybe that's the next processing method that people are.
Some of the other flavors probably won't survive it either, right?
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, this sounds like an experiment that someone who bought 60 bags or whatever, 500 bags of 60 kilos might want to run, but not us.
Yeah. It sounds like an experiment that a coffee nerd would not run, right? They wouldn't, they wouldn't want to risk it.
Yeah. And again, I mean, again, this goes back to who's dealing with this. You early on mentioned that it's like, is it a specialty thing or versus a commodity thing? And I think the answer is that it shows up in commodity coffee more because there's a lot of commodity coffee. And so if you buy 500 bags or a shipping container worth of coffee, there's going to be a moisture gradient. Like, you know, if there's a little water in there, and some bags might be affected and others might not. And you might care a lot about making sure that not all of your bags are problematic. The problem with doing these measurements is it's inherently difficult to find which beans are actually affected because it's not all 60 kilos in a bag. It's going to be like 1 per 1,000 or whatever the magic number. Right. David, tell me, what was the magic number? Do you know?
They have 13 out of 25 that they found, right? Mold in it. And, you know, it was all commodity coffee, which back then there was a lot more percentage of commodity coffee. And right now, the best estimate I think I've found is that 70% of the coffee that is drunk is considered commodity. And the other 30% is not all specialty either, but it is at least 20% specialty.
Shall we just cut to table 7 in this paper? Because I think that's kind of the important table. They did a good job of looking at a lot of different coffees. They captured a lot of different aspects of the production process, going from green to brown all the way through. But in table 7, if you look here, they are reporting the amount of ochratoxin A per kilogram of ground coffee. So this is not in the cup. This is in the solid. And well, what do you glean from this table?
You know, I think what's interesting about this is that you know that there is a significant amount in some of them, right? And it's more than I'm comfortable with seeing, you know, even if it is clearly molded, and the one that is clearly molded versus the one that is maybe not visibly observable is still significant, right? That was my first inclination.
Are you specifically speaking about that the entry, which is Arabica, Robusta, that has a lot of it?
Right.
Yeah. So that one at the upper limit, I think they say without the immunopurified extract process, they're still getting like 10 micrograms of this compound per kilogram of ground coffee, and it's sort of worst case
Which
scenario.
we're not drinking a kilo, but it's close to that daily limit, right?
Yeah. So, well, we'll do a little bit of math in a minute, but yeah. So you've picked out, there's this table, what, for their listeners not going to read the paper, this table has like 30 entries in it or something. 40. How about that?
Yeah.
40
Yes.
entries. And in here, it looks to me as though there's maybe only 4 or 5 coffees of those that seem to be affected in a way that we might start to raise an eyebrow at, which is
right.
Well, 4 out of 40 is 10%. So that's not a good number. They basically start to make an estimate of whether it's going to be a problem for you or not. We don't need to dwell on this part of it beyond saying that it's very difficult to make that estimate. And they, taking their conservative approach, they say it's going to be a minor, if any, role in causing any long-term problems. Whether or not you want to choose to believe their ability to estimate is a separate thing, but I think that covers paper 1. Doran.
Yeah, the one thing I thought was really interesting about this paper was their determination that the ochratoxin isn't really affected by roasting. So like they have in figure 3, they're showing these bars of the Ochratoxin A content in coffee that's obviously contaminated and also coffee that's been inoculated. So artificially had this Ochratoxin A added to it and spiked in. And you can see that before and after roasting, there's almost no change in the level of the ochratoxin. And they also show another figure of just like Ochratoxin A by itself that they heat up to 270 C. And you can see it takes over 10 minutes for it to really start to go down, but it's still quite present. So they're making the case in this paper that the Ochratoxin A is kind of impervious to being roasted out of a coffee sample.
Which leads us to paper 2.
Perfect segue.
Yeah, right. He's a professional. Which is that basically paper 2 is like, hey, if we got green coffee that has ochratoxin A in it, does it go away when you roast it?
Right. And also when you brew it, right? Because
exactly.
Soluble is a great way to see, granted it's much more clinical than the daily coffee brew.
They give an intro here and they cite, I don't know, 7 papers or something in the process, basically saying that there's considerable inconsistencies in the dispute as to whether roasting coffee degrades this compound in one form or another or not. And this paper, we've cherry picked one. We could have picked any one they've cited. This paper makes the very strong case that roasting destroys it.
Right.
Okay, good. So there's so that and I think so, just for what it's worth, this is the example where they bought a ton of this stuff. They bought 50 bags. Oh, no, they bought 280 bags at 60 kilos each because this paper's from Nestle.
Right.
Okie dokie. David, tell us what happened in this paper.
So, what they basically come to as their conclusion is that it significantly reduces, the OTA initially present in the green coffee when you roast it, and then an additional reduction when you create a soluble manufacture process.
Yeah.
And, to be fair, even though Nestle has a vested interest in showing that there is a reduction no matter what quality of coffee you buy with the OTA, they also I didn't see any issues in their setup, and I thought it was even interesting to see their scheme personally. And again, not scientist here, just coffee guy who turns things green to brown. I thought they did a good job of actually following it through the process, and I didn't see any issues in their setup to show that it was able to be done, other than the fact that they're continually looking at it from a liquid chromatography process similarly. And I don't think that they did they do any that they peated with OTA or intentionally spiked? I don't know that they did.
No, so this one was the one where they're basically observing phenomenologically what's in those bags of coffee. They're sampling a bunch of it, trying to figure out how much of there is. They have a really nice histogram, which is basically what's the number of coffees that they end up counting a certain magnitude of OTA present in. And there's one example there. I mean, there must have been one really bad sample, because there's one coffee that they sampled that was really high, and that obviously was a problem. But then the rest of them are sort of sitting in what looks to be a skewed Gaussian centered around 8 parts per billion, which is 8 nanograms per kilogram. So
Right.
so that's that sort of aligns more or less with basically saying this coffee was one of the I looking back, I think on table 7, I need to remind myself before we'll cut this out and get it right. So 8 nanograms per kilogram is well below the limit of 1 microgram per kilogram in the previous paper. So even just within 3 years, this paper is making a measurement at 3 orders of magnitude higher fidelity than the previous one. Okay, so this is a Thai Robusta. So
Right.
Interesting. I don't know if I've ever had a single origin Thai Robusta.
I have once.
How
And
was
an
it?
interesting fact about Thailand is it's one of the few countries where most of the coffee is used for domestic enjoyment rather than export.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that is interesting because this is 280 bags going over to Switzerland.
So somebody's buying it.
Somebody, yeah.
I-
Okay. Yeah. Well, so we've made the point. The central finding here is they think that roasting coffee decreases it by a lot. But the interesting thing that jumped out at me is they think that the chaff is where it's at. They think that
That's a
Ochratoxin A
very
is in the
interesting-
chaff.
Yeah.
What? Well, what to make of that? I think when I'm just reading through this and I see this interesting like estimate of how much chaff has been collected off of roasting, which by the way is hard for them to measure anyway. So they actually spend some time discussing why they have 3 different interval levels, and they're just being. They could have made a graph, actually. It would have been better. But anyway, nonetheless, the point here is they believe that when you roast the coffee, it goes the amount of Ochratoxin A is decreased, and they believe it is further decreased if you then brew the coffee and then make instant coffee from it. And they believe it's going away with the chaff. Doran.
Yeah, just to give some insight into the magnitude of this effect. So they have this table 3 where they're showing the levels of Ochratoxin A in different stages of the process. So in their uncleaned green coffee, over 3,000 kilograms of the green coffee, they're seeing an average Ochratoxin A concentration of 7.3 micrograms per kilogram, which is decreased to 1.4 micrograms per kilogram after roasting. And then if they analyze just the chaff that they pull off out of the roaster, that chaff has a concentration of 155 micrograms per kilogram. So it's heavily concentrated in the chaff, which kind of makes sense if you imagine like you're a mold. You probably want to grow in a specific part of the coffee. And so if that
we all came from mold, right?
yeah. So if that part of the coffee gets ejected from the roasting process, it's no longer in a form in which you're going to brew it and extract it. It's been mechanically separated.
Yeah. Oh, so takeaway at least from paper 2 is don't do an all chaff brew. Just cut it loose.
But they do also make the case that part of the reduction of the Ochratoxin A has to come from thermal degradation.
It does,
because
yes.
it's not enough. There's not enough Ochratoxin A in the chaff to compensate or to make up the entire portion of Ochratoxin A in the roasted or in the green coffee. So some of it's thermally decomposed.
Yeah, and just actually to hit that point, earlier we mentioned that it's made from phenylalanine condensing with Ochratoxin alpha through a peptide bond or an amide bond, and those bonds are what are in proteins, and you can cleave up proteins by cooking at 140 Celsius.
Right.
So people used to say like Ochratoxin doesn't degrade until 200 Celsius and above. But actually what they're actually saying is they are degrading it at 200 Celsius for some time. But that bond should be broken at lower temperatures. And so I think indeed that's what we're seeing in this paper.
And I think that, the other, sort of takeaway you could have is that it probably isn't wise to consume a green coffee or, white coffee product.
And well, we still haven't quite got to this 1 microgram per day limit for the average human, but let's go through the final paper here, because I think this is the one that you've read in great detail. And I made a note on this that says, let's see if you can read this. Complicated.
It is complicated.
Because this paper, oh my goodness, this one hurt my head. I tried to read it 2 times. This is the one where they take coffees that have it naturally occurring in it for, for mold reasons. And then they also take it and then inoculate it with they create the scenario where it's going to grow it. And for me, and I really struggle to understand the value in the inoculation, because if you already have proof that it does grow, then why inoculate? But David, tell me, help me understand this.
I mean, again, the non-scientist in the room trying to describe to a scientist what the research setup is a fool's errand, to say the least.
That's the whole podcast. This is
watch guys struggle, to describe what happened here. And this is the one that made me actually dig deeper, though, because as you look at it, it does look like the only takeaway I can have from this is don't store your coffee in an agar plate. That's for darn sure, right? That's a bad idea.
Yeah, if you moisten up the coffee and then you put it in a stable temperature on agar, which is giving it plenty of material to grow on. Yeah. Then
you're gonna get some messy stuff, right?
Things get pretty weird. Yeah. So if you start looking though at they have all these different samples, and a lot of these toxins are not detected. They have 3 samples out of I don't know, it looks to be about 25 in that case. 3 samples that show that Ochratoxin A is present, which is close to 10%, kind of the alignment that we the alignment that we had from the previous 2 papers ago. Geez. I mean, I read through it and I made a couple of notes, but I think the central finding for me on this one was that, I don't know, did only the inoculated one show a dramatic response? Is that the way I should read this?
That's the way that I look at it, is that at first glance, it looks much worse than it is, I believe. And one of the conclusions or I guess one of the hypotheses that they state at the beginning of the paper is that not just storage alone can prevent, the I guess, spread of OTA, but they disprove that hypothesis in their own setup, in my opinion, because it does seem that their spiked samples are the ones that have, especially, the way you broke it down with the WHO's recommendation.
Yeah.
That's where it does look like you have the most risk, right?
Just handle it well, which is obviously, but because I mean, what the hell does that even mean? But what they're really trying to say is, like, don't get your coffee wet and let it sit at a stable temperature for a long time and expect it to not grow mold. It's a product that was grown on Earth, and it's gonna be inherently a good platform because it came from biology. Even if it's roasted, there's still molecules in there that this mold can eat and poop out bad things. And that's like, that's basically that's what this paper is making the case. Now, by the way, they did say that when they in their case, they roasted, it did degrade a bit of it, but not all of it. So this is a paper going back the other way, saying roasting doesn't destroy it all. I mean, I'll put a nail in this. If someone wants to fund me for this, I'll put a nail in it. So let's go back to this 1 microgram per day per person. Okay. So I weigh more than that, but I'll take 70 kilos as an average. Many people listening weigh less than that. Just appreciate we're sort of in the middle here. It doesn't really matter. It's plus or minus a little bit, but 1 microgram of this particular compound per day. And in many of these coffee samples, we were looking at 1 microgram per kilogram. Okay. So let's say you drink a cup of coffee and you have 20 grams of dry mass coffee in your hand. You're looking at 1/50th of a microgram in that coffee. Now let's assume you get quantitative extraction of that compound into the cup. At that point, you're at 1/50th of your daily intake. And so you might think, oh, well, fine. So I could drink, 10 cups and we're on our way. But the thing is that Ochratoxin A doesn't only come from coffee. In fact, the worst offending substance for Ochratoxin A is actually oatmeal.
Okay. So, yeah.
Yeah, basically.
Your oat milk latte might put you over the top.
So I thought about that. I thought about, wouldn't a funny outcome be if, like, this is the dagger for oat milk? But I've been waiting for this day.
Yeah, no. Me too.
Yeah, right. It's like whole grains and oats, and the reason is because those are those things need water, and they're hygroscopic, so they absorb water, and they're really good sources of carbohydrates, and they have protein in them. So they're like obviously a perfect platform for growing mold. But more importantly, okay, let's do the example. Even if it was 10 micrograms per kilogram, you'd still only be at 1/5 of your daily intake by having a 20-gram dose. Go on, Doran.
Yeah. So in this one, in table 3, they're showing that depending on what you inoculate the coffee with, there are different production levels of Ochratoxin A, and the A Niger strain produces 91 micrograms per kilogram. But if you scroll down a bit and look at figure 3, you can see they've done a chromatography syn, and their integration is all whacked out. And this is something that you should hide and bury in the supplemental information if you know what you're doing, or just fix and change your method. Because
panel B and panel C.
Yeah.
D is less egregious because the peak's really small, but panel B and panel C are a very clear baseline.
You cannot do that. So that kind of throws out the window their analysis of how much Ochratoxin A there is, because they're not appropriately integrating the peak that comes out. So,
and that's in the inoculated one where they're like trying to grow, like trying hard to make a lot of it.
It's less than 100. It's less than 100 micrograms per kilogram.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. In naturally occurring samples, we all saw like a 10. Okay. Point is, even if with 1 cup of coffee, you get 1/5 of your daily intake of this thing in a coffee that is so heinously affected by mold that there is no human. And I know a guy who has zero taste. Like, this guy is useless. You put anything in his mouth, he's like, yeah, it's fine. We had this corked bottle of wine. This guy, you couldn't even get like within 10 feet of the bottle. The guy drank the whole thing. Didn't even bother him. Didn't touch the sides. So there's no way you would have 2 cups by choice of coffee that has 10 micrograms per kilogram of in the dry mass of Ochratoxin A. That is going to be so molded. It's gonna smell. It's not the ochratoxin probably that smell. It's gonna be all the other compounds getting pooped out by the mold. But my God, it's gonna smell bad. There's absolutely no way. So all of this is just simply to say, it's like there are a lot of things in your life that you should worry about. David, I know you're still probably worried about this a little bit, but I think if you had to like give the nugget to the, like, you want someone to take home the message here, that they would need to drink some, like, let's be conservative. They'd need to drink 25 cups of coffee. And even at that point, that would only be if that coffee, which would be only a 10% hit rate of exhibiting even an appreciable amount of this mold, back in 1998 or whatever. So like, I didn't finish that sentence. Point is, you'd have to drink a lot of coffee, and you'd have to drink a lot of a deliberately molded coffee in order to expose yourself to the daily intake risk that would cause you potentially renal problems.
Right.
Oh man, the media, just the influencers, just love to say you're going to die.
Gun, right?
I'm going to give you homework, David. Here it is. Do this. It's up to you. It's not a recommendation. I'm not giving you the recommendation that everyone do this, but this is something to think about. Is that even in the one where they inoculated it and deliberately tried to grow the bad thing, okay, and they got the maximum at 100 micrograms per kilogram. If you deliberately do what my undergrad did, submerge the coffee in the water, deliberately try and grow mold, pull it out, and then go ahead, put 20 grams on the table, grind it up and cup it, and taste it once. 2 milliliters, taste it. You're not, that exposure, health, really. The exposure is like, well, you can do the math, but that is well below your daily limit.
Well below. Yep.
Yeah, well below. And you can figure out whether you taste it or not. The answer is you're definitely going to taste this. Tastes like shit.
Certainly going to taste it.
Yeah.
So yeah, beyond a reasonable doubt, with just the research that exists, we can say that there is no, reason to be concerned for your human health and safety in drinking coffee. Now, maybe drinking oat milk.
Yeah, well, I don't know the process. Yeah. I mean, who knows? One of the good questions that's come up from this, though, is they did mention, I focused on ochratoxin coming from some type of mold that I can't pronounce. I think it's Aspergillus ochra something or other. Good.
Yeah, gracious or something, right?
Yeah. And then also, I guess, the penicillium molds that also create penicillin, change the world, also poop these things out as well. I don't really, look, I'm not a mold guy. All right. I see mold, it goes in the trash can. I don't think about this very much. So like, but when you know when you got mold, right? There's not a single person that comes in there, smells, and like, we got mold in here, right? Everyone knows that. It's not. So I feel like the real paper that I wish existed was the human sniff test. Where's
how accurate is the human sniff test?
Yeah, like, oh, this is gone. Just for what it's worth, Ochratoxin A is not even close to really bad for you. Like, not.
Really?
Oh no, I mean, Botox is really bad for you. It's the bad thing. There are very few things on this planet and beyond that I could not ingest 1 milligram of right now and survive. Okay. Now we don't need to test it, but the point is, I'm big. I'm 100 kilos, and 1 milligram. I'm made of machines that destroy things. 1 milligram will get destroyed of almost everything. Now, you can pick a bunch of things that it would not destroy and could hurt me, and Ochratoxin may hurt me, but I will not die. Not with 1 milligram.
This is sounding very superhero movie setup right now at this point.
Doran, did we forget anything?
No.
The executive summary here, though, is yes, there's Ochratoxin A in coffee, and it occurs in about 10% of coffees that are not treated in some careful way where you don't expose them to water. But the coffees the coffees you purchase them because they taste good, because they've been treated in a way that did not expose them to molding and phenolic defect and all these other things. And so the likelihood of
I would judge them harshly for other attributes far before the mold would be a factor in the issue.
Absolutely. And so when you're selecting for these coffees, I mean, we don't have the research to say this, but I guarantee you can smell a really badly molded coffee. And even in that case, first of all, you would never buy it it's off brand for the company. But second of all, even if you were to buy it, the worst case scenario of a naturally occurring one, you can have a cup very safely, and it won't even get close to touching the sides of your daily intake maximum.
So we've come full circle. I now can tell people just buy specialty coffee, right?
Sure. Here we are. We've done it. We've said it all. Let's get out of here. We got to go do things.
Yeah.
We're going to go down. I think Doran and I are
work.
going to have some coffee. So
thanks for having me, guys.